Hello, I'm Olivia Mattis, and I'm delighted that you've chosen to spend some of your Sunday with us today. Happy summer. I'm excited about several different things. So, first of all, let me just reiterate that we have a museum opening in Portugal dedicated to our hero, Aristides de Sousa Mendes. It will be called the Aristides de Sousa Mendes Museum, and it will be in his home in a little village in Portugal called Cabanas de Viriato. And it's opening on July 19th, 2024, very soon. So we have one more program before that happens. We have a program on July 14th that I'll tell you about later. The next day, I'm hopping on a plane going to Portugal for the opening of the museum. So it's so exciting. This is a project that's been years in the making, and it's finally here. The second thing I'm excited about is that today's topic, it turns out, is one that is connected to me personally. And this is a total surprise to me. So we were planning this program when all of a sudden I got an email from my dear cousin, Vicky is her name, saying that her father was a Ritchie boy, my uncle. And here he is, Stephen Fabry, born in 1911, died in 1966. I never knew my uncle, but we have this wonderful connection that we're doing a program on the Ritchie Boys, and here it is that he himself was a Ritchie boy. And I believe that Stephen's daughter and grandson are on this call, so I'm delighted. Today we have a moderator, and that's Mark Zaid. You've met Mark in the past. We did a whole program on whistleblowers. Mark is an attorney. He is a widely published author, and he is an authority on many World War II related subjects, and he very kindly agreed to moderate today's program. So Mark, I'm going to turn the program over to you now.
Thank you, Olivia. Welcome, everyone, to the Sousa Mendes program. Fantastic program on the Ritchie Boys. This also has some level of personal connection to me. I have driven by Camp Ritchie for years. I'm in Maryland, suburbs of DC as well. And my children attended a very well-known 100-plus-year-old sleepaway camp that literally is walking distance to Camp Ritchie. And I would drive past it. Sometimes we'd actually go on the campus because they'd shuttle bus us over to the camp if there were too many campers. And I would literally every year Google what Camp Ritchie is, because it is this incredible camp and buildings in the middle of nowhere. Like, why is this camp here? So I am incredibly happy to be able to moderate this program. My maternal grandfather, not a Ritchie boy, but an American chaplain who served in the U.S. Army and helped liberate Dachau back in 1945. So much of what the Ritchie Boys did, no doubt, had connection to my grandfather as well. We will hear from two great speakers about Camp Ritchie and the nearly or so 20,000 Ritchie boys who trained up at this site. About 40% of them were immigrants, 2,000 to 3,000 of refugees of the Holocaust. And as we'll hear, the Ritchie boys were particularly trained to interrogate prisoners of war who were either brought there to the United States, they would translate and intercept messages, they'd engage in psychological warfare against the Nazis. Many of them would end up in the Normandy invasion, which we just celebrated the 80th anniversary of, some later at the Nuremberg trial. And it's said that up to 60% of the intelligence gathered in the European theater came from the Ritchie boys. And some of them, I didn't even know until preparing for this program, are names you would know. Eugene Fodder, anybody who traveled around Europe would know who that was. David Rockefeller, J.D. Salinger, Ambassador Vernon Walters, and Archibald Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of President Teddy Roosevelt. I hope many, if not most of you, have been able to watch the Ritchie Boy documentary as part of this program. If you haven't, I highly encourage you to go back and do so. It is now 20 years old, but it is a fantastic 90-minute production about the Ritchie Boys and the in fact kind of humor and camaraderie between some of the Ritchie Boys back and forth is just a delight to watch. It really is a subject that is still somewhat hidden in our history and becoming more well known now, particularly thanks to two of our speakers. Back in 2021, the US Senate actually passed a resolution to honor the contribution and service of the Ritchie Boys. The U.S. Holocaust Museum awarded the Ritchie Boys in 2022 the Elie Wiesel Award, and there is pending a resolution or legislation introduced by Congressman David Trone of Maryland and Senator Ben Cardin, one of our two senators, to grant the Ritchie Boys a Congressional Gold Medal. Now, as many of you no doubt sadly know, we are losing so many of our greatest generation just by passage of time. In 2021, there were about 200 Ritchie Boys still alive. By 2022, only about 20 of them. Just 6 months ago, Guy Stern, who is featured prominently in the documentary, passed away at 101. But the memory of what happened at Camp Ritchie and the Ritchie Boys will continue to stay alive, especially because of our two speakers who I'm going to introduce now. We will first hear from Katie Self. She is the director and curator of the Ritchie History Museum since it was created in 2023. She previously worked at the McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina, and she holds a master's degree in museum studies and a postbaccalaureate certificate in digital curation from Johns Hopkins here in Maryland. Then Bernie LUBRAN, who is the president of the Friends of Camp Ritchie, and his late father Walter was a Ritchie boy who fled Nazi Germany in 1938 to come here to the United States. Bernie has spent 20 years researching and telling their stories and had his own distinguished career at the Export-Import Bank and the Treasury Department. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Katie.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you all for allowing me to be here and participate in this webinar. It's very exciting for me. I am the newest director of the Ritchie History Museum, which lies in Cascade, Maryland, at historic Fort Ritchie. I'm excited to share some of the information that I've learned since I began my directorship here back in September. The history of the fort is quite fascinating, and our museum covers actually the entire life of Fort Ritchie. So it's 1926 to the BRAC in 1998, from its prior just short of 1926 being a ice harvest and a secret military facility from World War II until the BRAC. So I'm excited to be able to tell you guys some about that today. But before we get into the Ritchie Boy training, it is essential to note that Camp Ritchie was already a military installation before it was used during World War II. In 1926, it became a summer training camp for the state of Maryland's National Guard. The Guard ended up deciding on this area because of its mountainous terrain, the man-made lakes from the ice company, as well as the railroad spur that ran through the entire property. These were also reasons that the military was able to facilitate it and turn it into a more permanent camp so quickly. In 1942, shortly after the December 41 attack at Pearl Harbor, the camp was rented by the U.S. Army from the state of Maryland for just $1 a year to become a military intelligence training center, or you'll hear it referred to as MITC. And this is the home training ground of the Ritchie Boys. I want you to know first what Ritchie Boy means to the museum. The term Ritchie Boys has varied since the 1990s. However, the museum terms a Ritchie Boy as those who trained at Camp Ritchie and served in World War II. We include all 19,669 attendees at Camp Ritchie because though some of our records indicate or may be noted as non-graduate, some of those students were actually so good at their jobs that they were pulled for special assignments early or other training. So we can't just exclude those that say non-graduate. The castle image that you saw before this that had the confidential slash across it is actually an inspection day for the Ritchie Boys out in front of our most iconic building, the castle. Okay, so out of the nearly 20,000 attendees at Camp Ritchie, around 2,800 of these soldiers were refugees from Germany and Austria. who fled to the United States to escape the Holocaust. This number, I do not believe, includes every Nazi-occupied country. I would also like to mention that the training here was even more diverse with the Ritchie girls. About 200 of the Women's Army Corps served at Camp Ritchie, some of them going on to be interpreters and interrogators in the UK and the Pacific, as well as some stayed behind as instructors here and taught things like Army organization, German Army organization. Another group, the Nisei, which means the firstborn generation, Japanese American soldiers also trained at Camp Ritchie and worked with PACMIRS, which is the Pacific Military Intelligence Research Section, which focused on translating captured documents. As you can tell, there's a lot of diversity with around 70 countries being represented and multiple religions. But for today, we will focus more on the training that took place here at Camp Ritchie and not quite go into all the way that these men and women served. The soldiers in the pictures here are the actor group, the Composite School Unit, who created plays and mock scenarios for more immersive training, and we will discuss them more extensively here shortly. To show a little bit about our museum, this is a portion of our Ritchie Boys exhibit, which is focused on training. We try to put a lot of emphasis on the training and connecting how the training that they learned here connects to the rest of the exhibit that talks about their service. The training here was very specialized. There were different training classes offered from the military here at Camp Ritchie. The main class, though, was the intense MITC 8-week course with over 11,000 graduates. There were also other classes, such as special instruction and the counterintelligence core classes. The 8-week course, though, is the basis for these portions of our exhibit, though there is crossover in training material, of course. These special classes focused on a variety of field communications and entailed intense physical activities such as field exercises, close combat scenarios, and other unique activities. Here is an example of a course schedule from Class 16, third period of training, or at least this is the back portion of it. They were designed much like a college course roster in the ways it features the what, when, and where for each period of the day. Also included on the back side were the materials needed to complete these courses. Each course was broken down into sections. A section can consist of anywhere between 6 and 40 soldiers. It is generally larger than a squad, but smaller than a platoon. And sections are usually used in military headquarters or support organizations such as Camp Ritchie was at the time. Each section of a class would be assigned a building or classroom, and you can see that the courses were very diverse, but focused a lot on Axis Army organization, communications, their equipment. However, they also did learn a lot about the Allied forces as well. As I just mentioned, a significant focus of the 8-week course was identification and familiarization with both Axis and Allied forces. In particular, their uniforms, ranks, and insignia. This is because any Ritchie boy in the field had to be able to identify as much information from looking at a soldier before talking to them. Gathering information on a unit a soldier belongs to could give details on troop movements. Knowing things like their qualifications or specific cultural paraphernalia they may had on their person at the time could tell about their military service or their home life. All vital information for, say, reading between the lines to predict troop movements or to have a conversation later during interrogations, as the Ritchie boys tried to use a friendly approach to gain information. In many cases, the Ritchie boys would combine the knowledge from training with their shared knowledge of cultures they were fighting against to collect this pertinent info. This is why having natives of the cultures in intelligence was so significant. We couldn't necessarily teach culture to somebody that already knew the language, or we couldn't teach the language to somebody that can necessarily fight. So we needed somebody with the language and the cultural knowledge ahead of time. The above picture is a small German ID booklet from our collection that gives the breakdown of the German Army. The Ritchie boys learned more than just the uniforms. They put to memory all arms and munitions, artillery, vehicles, and basically all aspects of Axis Army organization. Again, this helps with identification, but it was practical knowledge that if they, which many of them turned out to be, spies or went behind enemy lines to sabotage the enemy, which, if I'm not mistaken, the video you watched has a couple of those Ritchie Boys in it. They would know about the weaponry, how to use it, and in many cases, sometimes how to break it. It could also help in cases where they were captured, or had to use captured weapons. The above image is from our collection, and it is a static display of Italian and German small arms and blades. These type of displays were pretty common in the classroom. We had them for communications, firearms, booby traps, all sorts of military information. Now I'd like to return to the CSU, the Composite School Unit. The CSU, to me, is by far the most exciting training at Camp Ritchie during World War II. It was vital in creating immersive experiences to teach different aspects of military warfare, from the need for secrecy to what field combat would be like. The training helps students prepare for what to expect in combat and to recognize what they were learning in the classroom in the field. The CSU was made up of a cadre of around 420 soldiers. They did all-access Army impersonations, often with captured equipment and prisoners of war. Camp Ritchie housed nearly 1,800 prisoners of war during the war. And the Ritchie Boys often used these prisoners to practice techniques, interrogations, and to be involved with enacting mock battles. Other groups assisted the CSU, but were not necessarily center stage. A group of African Americans was responsible for hauling equipment to and from the sites of training, and Native Americans also served with the CSU as German, Italian, and Japanese combatants when necessary. Above is an enactment of Japanese Army organization in winter gear with a captured Japanese Type 4 howitzer. Aside from the demonstration on uniforms, military strength, and artillery, the CSU consistently employed German and Japanese battle tactics to show the battlefield principles of the time. This helped the Ritchie Boys understand specific movements in the field and how and when they could collect intelligence. The goal of this immersive training was to make it as close to the real thing as possible. To aid in visualization and immersion, the Army constructed a full-size theater on the base where they conducted scenarios like mock Nazi rallies and plays on keeping military information secret. My personal favorites is Shut My Mouth, is the name of one of the plays. The most interesting immersive aspect, though, and one myself and a lot of visitors take interest in, was the life-size German village, where they would play out these mock battles and interrogations. The image here that you see is one of the German houses that was part of the village. You can even see inside that it is furnished with precise detail. As seen on the schedule earlier, there were more specialized classes outside Army organizations. Aerial intelligence is one of these courses, and one that a lot of visitors take an interest in. As well as those, they did classes on radios and other forms of communication like pigeon communication, phone and switchboard, and the SCR-284, which is a mobile radio. Above are two items a Ritchie Boy family donated last year, images he interpreted, and some of the reference materials for the field that he used. The document gives the lengths and widths of US military equipment. Aerial intelligence like this taught Ritchie Boys to pick up on all sorts of useful information, such as where an enemy may be storing their arms and munitions, and other targetable military structures. Now, what I gave is a very brief overview of some of the training at Camp Ritchie. It's very diverse and very in-depth. We have new materials that come in all the time, and we get more detail that connect dots between the training and how really extensive it was. It was a 8-week course, 7 days on, 1 day off, and was highly intense. The immense training led to most of the Ritchie Boys even noting in interviews and memoirs that nothing they encountered in combat ever surprised them after their training here at Camp Ritchie. And after learning about some of the training myself, I can see why. On that note, I will turn it over to one of our institution's biggest supporters, one of my Ritchie Boy experts, and a friend, Bernie LUBRAN, whose father was a Ritchie Boy.
Thank you, Katie. I want to talk about my father, who was a Ritchie Boy. He was born in Germany, Sebnitz, Germany, a small town on the Czech border, an hour east of Dresden. He attended public school in Sebnitz through the 5th grade, and then attended boarding school in Dresden through high school. And this is a quote from my dad's oral history. We had to wear a hat with the school colors, dark green and gold with a gold band. We used to go to the Elbe River in the winter. When the river was frozen, we would walk over the river to the school on the ice. Once we came late to school, Professor Fisher called up my father to complain. Father came down after that call and beat the hell out of me. He graduated high school in 1930, but faced a problem. There were quotas imposed on the number of Jews that could attend college. Dad had to give up his plans to become an attorney. Instead, he apprenticed at a department store. Next slide. In 1933, the Nazi Party gained control of the government, began to pass Aryanization laws that restricted the social, economic, and civil rights, including their rights to own and operate businesses. His parents lost their business, and the city foreclosed on their mortgage, and they lost their residence. These restrictions in Germany started at the national level, then in the major cities and in the small towns. Because they were in a small town, his father thought that they would be safe, and because of his World War I experience in the military, their family traced their roots back to 1740 in Germany, and they were on the border of Czechoslovakia where they had unlimited access. But by 1937 or 38, the family decided things were getting intolerable in Germany under the Nazis. Dad was the only member of his family that was able to obtain a visa to come to the United States. He left Sebnitz in September 1938. The rest of his immediate family, his parents, shown in the picture here, his sister, brother-in-law, and dozens of relatives perished in the Holocaust. Dad settled in Pittsburgh, where he found work in a department store and later moved to Cumberland, Maryland. On weekends, he would take the train for $1.50 to Pittsburgh. He met his future wife, my mother, there, and they were married in January 1942 in Cumberland, Maryland. 3 months later, my dad was drafted into the U.S. Army and inducted at Fort Meade, Maryland. Then later went to Fort Lee and then to Camp Ellis in Illinois. Next slide. From the time he was drafted until he received his citizenship, he was always with a big heavyset guy. This soldier on the far right was his roommate. He's from Baltimore, and he was in the insurance business. They traveled together to Camp Lee and then to Camp Ellis. At Camp Ellis, Dad was able to obtain his citizenship. The day after he received his citizenship papers, this fellow, the big fellow on the right, told him he was an undercover man from the FBI and that he had to report on Dad twice a week. He never saw him after that. Next slide. One day, Dad got a tap on the shoulder while he was at Camp Ellis, and he was told, "Pack your bags, soldier, you're going to Camp Ritchie." What's Camp Ritchie? Well, it's top secret. We can't tell you. It was a top secret military base. It was secluded. It's secluded in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Maryland. It was ideal because the infrastructure was already in place, and it was close to Washington, where the intelligence could be passed along to senior military officers. It opened June 19, 1942, as the Military Intelligence Training Center. Next slide. This is a picture of Washington County in the state of Maryland, and in the upper right-hand corner is where Fort Ritchie / Camp Ritchie was located. The green line down below is marking the Appalachian Trail. So you can imagine this was a very isolated part of Maryland, and it was ideal for these training exercises. Next slide, please. As Katie mentioned, Camp Ritchie was like no other Army camp in World War II. 54% of the soldiers were American-born. That meant 46% were foreign-born, the most from Germany and Austria, but from, as Katie mentioned, 70 countries. And by religion, it was a very diverse group, with 18% of the soldiers designating Jewish. This is, I think, one of the most unique features, that everybody worked together, everybody pulled together as a team, despite the background and some cases anti-Semitism or other prejudices that were practiced there. Next slide. Katie talked about these specialty training. After the soldiers went through the 5-week basic training, they had an additional 3 weeks, and most German and Austrian soldiers were trained to be interrogators of prisoners of war. As one Ritchie boy said, you can train a soldier in 6 months to fire a rifle, but you can't train a soldier to speak fluent German in 6 months. So Dad was a German interrogator of prisoners of war. That was his main training. But after he completed the 8-week course, class number 16, he stayed behind to specialize in order of battle analysis, which was a very important training activity for the soldiers. So he spent additional time at Camp Ritchie, and then he was sent to Fort Hunt in Alexandria, Virginia, which was uber secret interrogation center of German scientists and German military prisoners of war. and Dad was there. We never knew anything about his training at Fort Hunt until after he passed away. And that's been a challenge to understand what took place at Fort Hunt. After that, he went back to Camp Ritchie, was promoted to Master Sergeant, and then assigned to an IPW Team 141. Next slide. Training, as Katie's already mentioned, was intense. This is a picture of a group of German soldiers. Actually, they're the CSU that Katie talked about. This was a practice exercise, and oftentimes citizens in the nearby area would report that they were being invaded by German troops because they would see exercises taking place nearby, and it just created a lot of panic among the local residents, which was a very interesting story. Next slide. This is Dad's IPW team. My dad is on the right. The team was made up of 2 officers, Captain Henry Wagner and First Lieutenant Victor Wolf. Captain Wagner was a professor at Temple University, spoke German and Hungarian. Lieutenant Wolf was an insurance salesman who lived in New Jersey, was of German ancestry, and spoke German. The other 3 non-commissioned officers included a gentleman from Berlin who spoke German and French, another fellow from Austria, and a sergeant from Westphalia. So they used this advantage of the different locations to be able to interrogate German and Austrian prisoners in the dialect that they spoke at their home. So it was very important to be able to pull prisoners and find someone that could interrogate them, that could talk about the local soccer team or music at that town or other cultural activities to help break down the barriers with the prisoners so that they would feel comfortable to talk about important intelligence information. Dad told the following story. We had a case where they were waiting to cross the Rohr River west of the Rhine, and they had problems finding out what was going on. Finally, they picked up one lonely guy who wouldn't talk, so we told him to start digging a hole. We told him in German exactly how many meters deep to dig and how wide and how long. Halfway through, he realized he was digging his own grave, and he sure talked in a hurry. That was an example of the psychology that Ritchie Boys used. They didn't practice torture. They didn't shoot prisoners. They used psychology, and that made the German prisoners willing to talk, especially the non-Nazis. Nazis were a different commodity and had to be dealt with separately, but also using psychology, they were able to extract important information about troop movements and morale and strength of the German and Italian armies. Next slide. So the question is, well, what did they accomplish? These 20,000 soldiers. They had tremendous impact on the outcome of the war. Many Ritchie boys were able to single-handedly capture thousands of German prisoners merely by speaking over a microphone, a loudspeaker in German, and telling the soldiers on the front line that the war was over, they might as well give up because they were going to lose. And so the war was shortened. These Ritchie boys also made a contribution at the Nuremberg trials, where there were interrogators and translators for the high-level prisoners. They had a great impact on the amount of intelligence that was gathered, because they were able to interpret data and describe meaningful, important data that in many cases prevented them from being ambushed or worse fate. After the war, they came back as proud Americans. They came back as citizens of the United States and gave more to their country and were very, very grateful. I know that was the case of my father. He was a patriot. He loved this country. He passed away 24 years ago, and a lot of what I'm describing to you, I only learned after he passed away. He never talked about his military service in any detail. And that was what prompted me to do this research, because it was so fascinating to know what the Ritchie boys accomplished. Next slide. The Ritchie boys have never been recognized by this country for their achievements and contributions to World War II. Many other groups and other units have been recognized with a Congressional Gold Medal, and that's our goal, is to obtain for the Ritchie boys a recognition that their families can cherish for the rest of their lives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernie and Katie, for wonderful presentations and really helping us dig deep into this fascinating story. Audience members, please continue putting those questions in. I see there are already a ton of questions, so Mark has his hands full, but we're going to give you another 5 minutes to keep adding questions to the chat box, and Mark will get to as many as he can. Right now, it's my job to tell you about what we have upcoming. As I said, we have one more program upcoming before the opening of our new Sousa Mendes Museum. And so that is a program coming up on July 14th, and it's about the photographer Roman Vishniak, who took those photographs that you all know from the famous book A Vanished World, the book that was done in collaboration with Elie Wiesel. It's an incredible book, and I'm sure you all know about it. Well, you don't know the story of the man behind the photographs. And there's this brand new film out. It's produced by Nancy Spielberg, the sister of Steven Spielberg. She's a producer of documentary films. The filmmaker is Laura Bialis, and we have Laura, and we have the grandson of Vishniak, Professor Ethan Vishniak from Johns Hopkins University will be joining us. So this is a not to be missed program. I hope you will all sign up. You will get information after today's program about how to sign up for that program, and I hope you will. So now we're going to show you a trailer. It's a little bit on the long side. It's about 4 minutes long. So here is the trailer for the film Vishniak.
I was young. Once upon a time. I would watch the images that we know now emerge dark areas first, so there was this suspense about what that image would be. I remember he saying, "They're our family and we have to help." If only people could meet these people, it might be possible to still save some of them. His camera was like suspenders. He was never without them. We were Jewish kids in Berlin. I was being photographed a lot, which I hated. Yeah, I'm here with a Hitler poster. It has the usual slogan. We're fighting for peace and equality. We are so lucky compared to the millions of people that didn't get out of Europe. Nobody had time to feel lost. I mean, he had to survive. And he had his camera.
Roman Vizniak has been called one of the few true Renaissance men of our time.
He was considered by many as the world's foremost photographer of living things, too small to be seen by the naked eye.
Vizniak makes the invisible visible.
I mean, he was now in color. My father regarded himself as a mixture of Moses and Superman. Kind of a difficult, slightly crazy person to deal with. But the work was what counted.
All this life, it is so important to look closer, and the world will be bigger.
These people that we're seeing here, you know that very few of them survived.
Photography, it answers the question, who are we, from where we are coming and where are we going? Is it only a fleeting moment?
Okay, now I'll turn it over to your moderator, Mark Zaid, for your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Olivia. What a fantastic presentation by both Katie and Bernie. So much fantastic information. I've taken a lot of your questions, and let me go through as many of them as I can. For one thing, we have a number of relatives of Ritchie Boys, which is absolutely fantastic to make this very personal. And there are a number of questions that I'll throw out to you initially, Katie, about how can people help find records about their relatives from their service at Camp Ritchie, whether through you perhaps or the National Archives, Library of Congress. What would you suggest for how people can research things? And separately, if they want to donate items to you, to the museum, how can they go about doing so?
Sure. It really depends on how much information you have already. We are luckily received Dan Gross, the late Dan Gross's research information. He was probably the Ritchie Boy expert. We have, that's how we know there were as many Ritchie Boys as there are. He spent 25 years compiling all of their information as much as we could get. There's still, of course, some missing. So I would say if you believe your parent was a Ritchie Boy, you're welcome to contact us. We have a database. I can look it up by name. If you don't have like their what we call the ASN, the Army serial number, you would need that to possibly get records from the National Archives. Unfortunately, a lot of the personal military records, like the individual military records, I have learned a good portion of those burnt in '73 in the '73 fire at the National Archives. I know there's a lot of training information at the archives here towards Maryland, which I'm trying to work my way to. As far as being a part and contributing what you do have and what knowledge you have to the museum, you're always welcome to reach out to me personally at my director email. It's director@ritchiemuseum.org, or you can go on our website and there's all different ways to contact us.
Excellent.
Mark, can I add?
Yeah, go right ahead, please, Bernie.
I spent a lot of time at the National Archives 20 years ago when I first started doing this research. That is the best place to go, but you need to allow time. The records are not digitized, but you can find each class records, the courses that each student took, the grades they received. That's how I found out that my dad was second in his class of the 16th class, and that's what prompted him to be advanced to this Order of Battle school beyond the first 8 weeks.
So it was mentioned early in fact, in your, I think both when I did my introduction and in your slides, Bernie, about the 18% of the Ritchie Boys being Jewish. That's a very large number given the representation we are as a people in the United States, of course. And so some questions came about with to what extent was there any anti-Semitism at the camp? And how was that addressed, as well as the notion one person asked that the Germans were very good at identifying Jews from among their citizenry. And since there were 2,000 to 3,000 Holocaust refugees who came through Camp Ritchie and then presumably went back over, how were the vast majority of them able to pass unrecognized? I know 2 of them, unfortunately, were captured and executed by the Germans for being Jews. But if you can elaborate on that, and of course, Katie as well.
Well, for the Jewish soldiers, it was very risky to be in the U.S. Army in the European theater of operations. That is absolutely correct. Some veterans changed their name. Some Jewish Ritchie Boys changed the religion on their dog tag to a P or a C from an H for Hebrew. So they were aware of the risks.
Anything on anti-Semitism in the records or oral histories?
My dad never mentioned anti-Semitism, but other Ritchie Boys did. And I think that was just common in the United States in the 1930s and 40s. A lot of the military officers had been trained in eugenics, and a lot of soldiers at Camp Ritchie came from rural areas where there were no Jews and there were certain perceptions. But it never affected their morale or their ability to do their job.
Exactly.
And-
That's well put, Bernie.
Katie, you had mentioned that there were women who served at Camp Ritchie as well. So one question was about any stories of the women, as well as whether there were any African-American Ritchie boys.
Oh yes, yes. Actually, the Ritchie Boys Secrets is a good book that's written by Beverly Eddy, and Beverly also writes for our blog on our website. They pass through the gates of Ritchie. There were like I said, 200 of the Women's Army Corps here, served both in the European Theater and the Pacific Theater. One of them, we actually just received our first Women's Army Corps collection that gives us a peek into what it was like as a female instructor and student here at Camp Ritchie. So we're excited to get some of that on display. And there were African-American Ritchie boys. William Warfield, who you may know if you follow Showboat or television or opera. He had a very prominent career in television and opera after the war. And then there was also Daniel Skinner, who Beverly wrote a wonderful biography on him. And it talks about the social feelings at the time, and she indicates how they were treated. And it's very sad to see that sometimes, or most of the time, POWs were treated better than our own soldiers were. So I encourage anybody interested in those types of subjects to read the individual biographies, because you get to hear from all of them from a personal point of view.
There's one follow-up about whether women acted as interrogators. Did the women ever go overseas to the European theater? Did they stay at Camp Ritchie, where they could have acted as interrogators of some of the POWs that were there?
Oh no, they went overseas. A couple of them went, especially to the Pacific. The Nisei women that were here went into the Pacific Theater, and several of them were interrogators.
And I know it was, I think I mentioned, and I think Bernie mentioned about some of the Ritchie boys working on the Nuremberg trial proceedings in the aftermath of World War II. Can either of you talk about the role that any of the Ritchie boys played with the liberation of the camps, as well as any of the prosecutions after?
Oh yes, yes. A lot of the Ritchie boys themselves were at the liberation of Buchenwald and Dachau. I'm sure Bernie can probably give you much more details than I can, because I tend to focus more on the training, but I know they had a lot of hands in interrogations there, and even did undercover work in some of the camps.
There's a story of a Ritchie boy who was conducting an interrogation of a German officer, and the officer said, you're amazing. You speak fluent in German. How did you learn? And he said, I learned at Dachau. And that stopped the German soldier in his tracks, because several of the Ritchie boys had been placed in the Dachau concentration camp in the 1930s. They were able to get out. They left as soon as they could, and get Ritchie boys.
So we're getting to the end of the hour, and so let me ask you all to give us your final thoughts, starting with you, Bernie.
This is a story that needs to be told. There's just, I think the Ritchie boys kept to their secret, not to reveal what they learned. Most, and I've met hundreds and hundreds of family members who have told me that they never knew their relative was a Ritchie boy. We're getting queries every day, literally, from people who are just learning and discovering that their uncle, grandfather was a Ritchie boy. That story was never told because the records were classified. It needs to be told, and they need to be recognized for their achievements. Congressional Gold Medal is important for the family members to have a memory of their loved ones.
Katie, what would you like to say in closing to our audience today?
In closing, I would like to say, if you want to learn more about the Ritchie Boys and you haven't read Beverly's Ritchie Boy Secrets book or Henderson's Sons and Soldiers, those are two good sources to start with. And since there are so many Ritchie Boy family members on here, we are trying to put together, because I run into the same thing, Bernie, we end up getting a lot of people, a lot of families that won't have connections and learn about what their parents, mothers, or fathers did. So, and it's kind of hard to do that because not many of the Ritchie Boys are left. So we're trying to put on a Ritchie Boy family reunion here at the base next year, and hopefully have a dinner where we can have everybody come and, make those connections. We're hoping that'll turn out to be a fun event.
Hey, now that my uncle is a Ritchie Boy, I'm going to be there.
Can I
Mark,
just add one thing, that Ritchie Boys served in every major battle in the European theater, North Africa, Italy, Battle of the Bulge, Normandy, and also Ritchie Boys served in the Pacific. Along with the Nisei soldiers, many Ritchie Boys went to Philippines and to Burma. So their story needs to be told. That's the bottom line.
Mark, the last word goes to you.
Yes, this is a fantastic program. I thank everyone for participating today. Thank you for including me. Keep track of, either through the museum's website in particular, this effort to recognize the Ritchie Boys with the Congressional Gold Medal. No doubt that legislation will be reintroduced in the next Congress come January. And clearly from the short presentation we've had today, they are well deserving of it. And the documentary will be available, if I just read what was posted, up until tomorrow. Though it is 20 years old, it doesn't make a difference. This is about history. It is a phenomenal documentary, and the relationship and friendships between the Ritchie Boys just exudes from this film. I mean, I loved the humor between two of them in particular, and just seeing how they interacted with one another. So I really do appreciate that this is helping to keep this memory alive. And I love the fact that there's a museum there now. So my kids aren't at the camp next door, but I will still make a special trip up so I can come visit the museum.
So audience members, I expect to see all of you at that reunion next year. And many thanks to Mark Zaid for moderating. Thank you to our speakers, Bernie LUBRAN and Katie Self. Thanks to our wonderful audience. See you all at Vishniac, which is on July 14th, Bastille Day. We'll see you there and then. And have a wonderful rest of your day, everybody. Be well, everybody. Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.